Hi, social psychology class. I'm officially at home now, which means you can meet my cat. Here's my cat. Her name is Tootie. She's named after farts. So, yeah, when my partner Sean got her, he had two young sons, and he made the terrible mistake of letting them pick her name, and they named her Tootie after farting. So that's my cat. Today we are going to talk about Chapter 8. I've split Chapter 8 up into two different sections, so we'll have two little mini lectures over Chapter 8. Hopefully you can see the lectures here. Okay, so basically Chapter 8 is about groups. How do people function in groups? How do individuals influence the group, and vice versa? So here are the core questions that hopefully you remember from reading Chapter 8. We're going to basically talk about how groups help and hurt individual performance as the main topic of today's mini lecture of this first one. Okay, so before we jump into that, the first general idea in the chapter is that groups are at the heart of social psychology because we are, as a species, something that we like to form groups. Groups give us a lot of benefits. So 4 specific benefits that the chapter talks about are: first, groups provide social support. I think that we're all feeling the lack of that actually right now with the isolation of COVID-19. We're feeling kind of lonely and disrupted. And so it's a really nice way to remind ourselves that groups provide that kind of social support. They also can provide pragmatic or practical support, so things like sharing resources. So if you run out of toilet paper, knowing that you have a friend who might be able to loan you a couple of rolls of toilet paper would be a pragmatic type of support. Groups also can provide us a nice sense of identity. So for example, the fact that you are a BVU student tells other people about who you are. I'm wearing my BVU sweatshirt right now, so I consider myself a faculty member of BVU, so being part of the BVU group is something that hopefully brings you some pride and joy. Groups, of course, also provide safety. So we tend to kind of affiliate with other people, group up when we're afraid. Groups also, of course, provide safety in terms of numbers. If you think about other animals, for example, the safety of the herd, protecting older or sort of ill animals by surrounding them, that kind of thing. And then finally, groups can provide meaningful information. So the book talks about if you have to have a surgery, for example, knowing someone who's gone through that same kind of thing can provide you information. For a student level, maybe it's support groups while you're studying, sorry, not support groups, study groups that can support you while you're studying for an exam. So groups do provide a lot of information and psychological benefits to us as well. Okay, so it's interesting to think about groups and how they function, because I know for me as a student, I absolutely hated group projects. I was a very conscientious student. I wanted to maintain a 4.0 in college, and so I hated group projects because I hated depending on other people. The other people who were in my groups often loved group work because they knew that I would do all of the work and that they could kind of coast. So let's talk about how when we form groups, some people are motivated to work really hard and other people end up kind of taking the slacker role. Okay, so working harder in a group is called social facilitation. Social facilitation is when you work harder because other people are around. They can just be maybe watching you. So the first person to do research on this was a guy named Norm Triplett. He did this almost over 100 years ago now, actually. And so he was a psychologist, but he was also interested in bicycle racing. So he realized that when he was training for races, that even if he was on a stationary bike, he would pedal faster if there were someone else in the room than when he were by himself. So he realized, oh, I get a little bit competitive when there are other people in the room. He did a test of this in the lab where he brought people in and they were on stationary bikes and they were either tested by themselves or with other people in the room. And they weren't told to be competitive. They were told just pedal as fast as you can. And the people who were in the group settings always pedaled faster. He did the same thing. He replicated that with fishing reels. So he would bring people in and, you like spin the little fishing reel. I don't fish, so I don't know if that's the right motion, but you're basically like reeling in the line on the fishing reel. And people, again, did that faster when they were in a group setting compared to when they were tested by themselves. I think athletes have experienced the idea of if you have a lot of people watching, you've got that excited crowd and they're cheering for you, that motivates you, you might work a little bit harder. So all of those are examples of social facilitation. And for most psychologists, we say that the reason that you work a little bit harder when other people are around is because of what we call evaluation apprehension, which is the idea that you get a little bit scared that people are going to be watching you, judging you, evaluating you. And so you work harder because you want to look good to the other people. You know they're watching you and you want to sort of show off, impress them, or do a good job. Okay, so a really famous study on social facilitation was done in 1969 by this guy. His name is spelled with this Zajonc, and that's actually pronounced Zience, like it rhymes with science. So Zience did a study where he actually found social facilitation even in cockroaches. So you can see here in figure A, this is called a simple maze. It's clearly very simple because there's no turn in the maze. You just go from start to the goal. And basically he found that if he put cockroaches in this simple maze by themselves and then he timed them, they would run a certain amount of time. But then he set up these cockroach stadiums. So basically the cockroaches in figure B here, you can see that they have a cockroach audience boxes. So these other cockroaches can watch the main cockroach run through this simple maze. And when there were other cockroaches watching, or at least in the room, this main cockroach whose job was to run through the maze, it would actually run faster. So he thought that this was evidence that there's social facilitation in a lot of species, even a species like a cockroach. Okay, so social facilitation is when you work harder because other people are around. The opposite of that is social loafing, which is when you slack off, basically. So when the presence of others leads to you working less or a worse effort. This was tested in the lab by a scientist who brought in individuals and asked them to cheer as loudly as possible, and he recorded how loud they were. And then he brought them in groups, and he had the whole group. He said every single person cheer as loudly as possible, and he recorded how loud that was, and then he divided it by the number of people in the room. And he found that on average, the cheering was not as loud as when people were tested individually. So people weren't working as hard when they were in a group. And the idea was that you can kind of slack off a little bit in that kind of setting because no one can individually say like, hey, you weren't cheering very loudly, because it kind of gets lost in the group effort. So that's the idea of social loafing, of kind of like taking a little bit of a break and not working as hard because you feel like the other people will kind of make up for that. Now we know that not everyone has that tendency. So some people actually don't loaf. They actually work harder even if they feel like their effort won't be individually recognized. And the types of people who do not loaf tend to be high in agreeableness. So they're really cooperative. They're kind of like people pleasers. They also tend to be high in conscientiousness. That's the personality trait of kind of like perfectionism. You feel this responsibility. If I'm going to do something, I want to do it well. That's what conscientiousness is all about. And then the third one is called the Protestant work ethic. And that's got a little bit of weird, like historical religious tones to the name of it. But basically a Protestant work ethic is just the idea that you put in effort no matter what you do. So the old saying, if it's worth doing well. And it's kind of the belief that if I'm going to do anything, I'm going to put in some effort. So basically, these are the three traits that we find are correlated with people who are less likely to be social loafers in this kind of group setting. These are people who aren't going to loaf, even if we don't know that we can identify their effort. Okay, so an interesting thing about that Zience cockroach study that I mentioned earlier. So you saw that in the image here on the left, where it's the simple maze, where it's just a straight tube, basically, the cockroaches ran faster when there were other cockroaches watching, right? That's what we saw with the social facilitation research. Zients did a follow-up study where he gave them a more complicated maze. So you can see here that the cockroach starts here and the cockroach runs through and then doesn't know whether to turn left or right or go forward. And again, now other cockroaches are watching. So what he found was that the cockroaches run faster in a simple maze, but they actually run more slowly in a complicated maze when other cockroaches are around compared to when they do this exact same complicated maze by themselves. So social facilitation happened with the simple maze, but when it was a complicated maze, it actually hurt their performance. I don't know that you would really say that it's cockroach loafing, but they certainly slowed down when other cockroaches were watching. So social facilitation didn't happen no matter what. It's a little bit more complex. So basically, follow-up research from the Zients study with the cockroaches has found that there are different variables that affect whether social facilitation is going to happen versus social loafing. So one is the personality of the people involved, like we already discussed. So some people are going to do, they're going to work hard no matter what. But another variable is, what is the task we're asking you to do? So basically what the research has found that started with Zients and now has been replicated is that if the task is something that you're really good at already because you have a lot of practice, or it's a really simple task like just running down a straight alley maze, then social facilitation is going to happen for most people because you're already good at this thing. So other people around means you can kind of show off. But if the task is something that you're not used to doing, if it's new to you, or if it's complicated, then social facilitation actually hurts your performance. Not because you're not working as hard, but because you get kind of nervous. Again, that evaluation apprehension can kick in and you feel like people are going to judge me and see that I'm kind of messing up this task. So you actually get really nervous and your performance goes down. So social facilitation can kick in when you're good at the task and that the other people kind of energize you. But when other people are watching you do something that you're not already good at because it's new or complicated, it makes you nervous and that actually hurts your performance. So we see here that the effect of other people, or the social psychology of how well you do at a task, depends on several variables like your personality and the task itself. Okay, that's it for part 1 of this mini lecture. I hope that you enjoyed that. If you have questions, let me know, and I'm going to go ahead and record part 2.